By the time you finish listening to this, you will never see yourself or anyone around you the same way again. You will understand why people lie even when they love you. You will know why you sabotage yourself right before success. You will finally understand the invisible forces that have been quietly running your life, your relationships, your fears, and your deepest desires, all without you ever knowing. This is not a lecture. This is a mirror. And by the end, you will see clearly, perhaps for the very first time. Let us begin. The human mind is the most complex object in the known universe. More intricate than any galaxy, more layered than any ocean, more unpredictable than any storm. And yet, for thousands of years, people lived and died without ever truly understanding it. They blamed gods, demons, fate, and stars for the way they felt, the way they behaved, the way they loved and feared and fell apart. Then, slowly, a few brave thinkers decided to look inward, and what they found changed everything. Psychology is the scientific study of the human mind and behavior, but that definition does not do it justice. Psychology is the art of understanding why. Why do we cry at music that has no words? Why do we fear rejection more than death? Why do some people rise from ashes while others crumble under comfort? Why do we remember embarrassing moments from 20 years ago with crystal clarity but forget what we had for breakfast? These are the questions psychology answers. And today, in this single listening experience, you are going to travel through the entire landscape of this extraordinary science. We will move through the history, the theories, the discoveries, and the truths that researchers have spent centuries uncovering. We will talk about consciousness, memory, emotion, personality, mental illness, relationships, motivation, and the deepest layers of the unconscious mind. We will connect every idea to real life, because psychology is not something that lives in textbooks. It lives in you, right now, in this very moment, as you listen. So settle in, open your mind, and let us explore what it means to be human. The dawn of the mind, where it all began. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Greeks were already asking questions that psychologists still wrestle with today. Socrates said, "Know thyself." Aristotle wrote about memory, dreams, and the senses. Plato divided the soul into reason, spirit, and desire, which sounds remarkably close to what Sigmund Freud would propose 2,000 years later. These early philosophers did not have laboratories or brain scans, but they had something equally powerful: the courage to ask uncomfortable questions about human nature. For centuries, the study of the mind was tangled up with philosophy and religion. People believed that mental illness was caused by evil spirits. Treatment often involved prayer, exorcism, or confinement. The idea that the mind could be studied scientifically, that behavior could be observed and measured and understood, was considered almost heretical. But the world was changing. In the year 1879, a German scientist named Wilhelm Wundt opened the very first experimental psychology laboratory in Leipzig. This moment is often called the birth of psychology as a science. Wundt wanted to break consciousness down into its basic elements, the way a chemist breaks matter into atoms. He called this approach structuralism. He would have people sit in his lab and describe their inner experiences in precise detail while he measured their reaction times and sensations. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, the mind was being treated as something that could be studied, not just believed in. Then came William James, the father of American psychology, who disagreed with Wundt. James was not interested in breaking the mind apart. He was interested in what the mind does, how it helps us survive, adapt, and function. He called his approach functionalism. James also wrote one of the most influential books in psychological history, The Principles of Psychology, a massive, sweeping exploration of consciousness, habit, emotion, and will. He wrote that the greatest revolution of our generation is the discovery that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes of mind. That idea alone is worth sitting with for a moment. The unconscious, the part of you that runs everything. Now we arrive at one of the most dramatic, controversial, and endlessly fascinating figures in the history of psychology: Sigmund Freud. Freud was a Viennese neurologist who began his career studying the physical brain. But he became obsessed with something far more elusive: the unconscious mind. He believed that beneath the surface of conscious awareness, there existed a vast, churning world of hidden desires, repressed memories, unresolved conflicts, and primal drives. And this hidden world, he argued, was the true engine of human behavior. Freud proposed that the mind had 3 layers. The first was the conscious mind, which is everything you are aware of right now: your thoughts, your sensations, this voice you are hearing. The second was the pre-conscious mind, which holds memories and information that you are not thinking about right now but can easily bring to awareness. And the third, deepest layer was the unconscious, which contains everything that has been pushed out of awareness because it is too painful, too shameful, or too threatening to face. But Freud went further. He also divided the self into 3 structures: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the primitive, instinctual part of you. It wants pleasure, immediately, without consequence. It does not understand the word no. It does not care about society or morality. It simply wants. The superego is the opposite force, the moral judge within, the internalized voice of parents, culture, and rules, constantly demanding perfection and punishing you with guilt when you fall short. And caught between these 2 warring forces is the ego, the rational, reality-based part of you that tries to negotiate a livable compromise. Freud believed that most psychological suffering came from the endless, exhausting war between id and superego, with the poor ego doing its best to keep the peace. When the pressure became too great, the mind would resort to defense mechanisms, unconscious strategies designed to protect the ego from anxiety. You have used these. Everyone has. Repression pushes painful memories out of consciousness entirely. Projection takes feelings you cannot accept in yourself and assigns them to someone else, so the person who is furious might accuse everyone around them of being angry. Rationalization creates logical excuses for behavior that was actually driven by emotion. Denial refuses to acknowledge reality. Displacement redirects feelings from their true target to a safer one. And then there were dreams. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. He believed that in sleep, the sensor that normally guards the unconscious relaxes, and hidden desires and fears leak through in symbolic form. The manifest content of a dream is what you remember, the story, the images. The latent content is the hidden meaning underneath. Freud spent decades decoding the symbolic language of dreams, and while many of his specific interpretations have been questioned or rejected by modern science, the core insight that our sleeping minds reveal things our waking minds prefer to hide has proven remarkably durable. Freud also gave us the idea of psychosexual development, the theory that personality is shaped by how we navigate a series of stages in childhood, each centered on different sources of physical pleasure and conflict. The oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. He believed that if a child got stuck or fixated at any stage due to too much or too little satisfaction, it would leave a permanent mark on their adult personality. The person who is overly dependent or seeks constant reassurance might have fixation from the oral stage. The person who is obsessively neat and controlling might be stuck in the anal stage. These ideas made Freud famous and scandalous in equal measure. Much of Freud's specific theory has been revised, challenged, or outright abandoned by modern psychology. But his foundational insight that we are not fully aware of the forces driving our behavior That beneath conscious thought there is a whole architecture of hidden influence remains one of the most important ideas in the history of human thought. The rebels, Jung, Adler, and the breaking away. Freud had disciples, and two of the most brilliant eventually broke away to build their own towering theories. Carl Gustav Jung was Freud's chosen successor, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. But Jung could not accept Freud's obsession with sexuality as the root of everything. Jung believed the unconscious was far richer and stranger than Freud imagined. He proposed that beyond the personal unconscious, each individual also carried a collective unconscious, a deep reservoir of shared human experience that had accumulated over millions of years of evolution. This collective unconscious was populated by archetypes, universal symbols and patterns that appear across all cultures, all myths, all dreams, all time. The hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother. These were not individual memories, but inherited structures of the human psyche, ancient templates through which we make meaning of our lives. Jung believed that psychological health came from a process he called individuation, the lifelong journey of integrating all the parts of yourself, including the shadow, the dark and rejected aspects of your personality that you prefer not to acknowledge. He said that what you resist persists, and what you deny in yourself will find other ways to emerge, often destructively. True wholeness required befriending your darkness, not eliminating it. Alfred Adler broke from Freud for different reasons. Adler believed that the central driving force of human behavior was not sexuality, but the striving for superiority, the deep, universal desire to overcome feelings of inferiority and achieve competence, significance, and belonging. He coined the term inferiority complex, though his original meaning was more nuanced than the popular use of the phrase. Adler believed that everyone begins life feeling small and helpless, and the entire trajectory of human personality is shaped by how we respond to that original wound of perceived inadequacy. Some people respond by developing genuine competence. Others compensate through aggression, dominance, or the need to always be right. Others give up entirely. Adler was also ahead of his time in emphasizing the social nature of human beings. He insisted that psychological health could not be achieved in isolation, but only in genuine, cooperative connection with others. Behaviorism. Forget the mind, watch the behavior. While Freud and his followers were exploring the depths of the unconscious, a completely different revolution was happening in laboratories across the world. And this revolution wanted nothing to do with minds, consciousness, or inner experience. It only cared about what you could see. Behaviorism was built on a simple, radical premise. Psychology should study behavior, not the mind, because behavior is observable and measurable and objective, while the mind is none of those things. The founder of this movement was John B. Watson, who in 1913 declared that psychology must become a science of behavior, not of consciousness. He wanted to model psychology after physics and chemistry, precise, objective, and experimental. The most famous behaviorist was B.F. Skinner, who expanded the principles of conditioning into a comprehensive theory of human behavior. Skinner believed that all behavior, not just simple reflexes, but complex habits, emotions, language, and personality, was shaped by its consequences. Behavior that was followed by positive outcomes, which he called reinforcement, would increase in frequency. Behavior followed by negative outcomes, which he called punishment, would decrease. He called this operant conditioning, and he demonstrated its power with remarkable precision using animals in specially designed boxes, now known as Skinner boxes, where he could control every aspect of the environment and shape behavior with extraordinary accuracy. Before Skinner, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov had already demonstrated classical conditioning with his famous experiments on dogs. Pavlov noticed that his dogs began salivating not just when food arrived, but when they heard the footsteps of the person who usually brought food. He systematically studied this phenomenon, pairing a neutral stimulus, a bell, with food until the bell alone caused salivation. The dogs had learned to associate a previously meaningless sound with something meaningful. This seemed simple, but its implications were profound. It meant that emotional responses, fears, attractions, aversions could all be learned through association, without any conscious decision or understanding. John Watson famously demonstrated this with a deeply disturbing experiment involving an infant known as Little Albert. Watson conditioned the child to fear a white rat by pairing the rat with a loud, startling noise. The child, who had initially shown no fear of the rat, soon became terrified of it. And then, through the process of stimulus generalization, became afraid of anything white and fluffy. This experiment, conducted in a time before ethical guidelines protected research participants, demonstrated both the extraordinary power of conditioning and the dark potential for psychological harm. Behaviorism dominated psychology for decades. It gave us enormously practical tools: behavior therapy, token economies, systematic desensitization for phobias, applied behavior analysis. But it also had a profound limitation. By refusing to look inside the mind, it could not explain creativity, language, problem-solving, or the rich inner life of human experience. Something was missing. The cognitive revolution. Thinking about thinking. In the 1950s and 60s, a revolution swept through psychology. Researchers began to insist that the mind was not just a black box receiving inputs and producing outputs. It was an active processor of information, constructing meaning, forming representations, making inferences, and shaping perception. This was the birth of cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists were deeply influenced by the new technology of computers. They used the computer as a metaphor for the mind, the brain as hardware, the mind as software, mental processes as programs. This was not a perfect metaphor, but it was enormously generative. It allowed psychologists to talk about attention, memory, language, and problem-solving in precise, measurable ways. Memory became one of the most intensively studied topics in cognitive psychology. Researchers discovered that memory is not like a video recording that captures and replays events with perfect accuracy. Memory is a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you are not playing back a stored file. You are rebuilding the experience from fragments, filling in gaps with inference, expectation, and current knowledge. This is why eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. This is why two people can have completely different memories of the same conversation. This is why your memory of your childhood is not a faithful documentary, but a story you have been telling and retelling and subtly rewriting for decades. Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most important cognitive psychologists of the 20th century, demonstrated through decades of brilliant and sometimes controversial research that memories could be implanted. In her famous experiments, she showed that simply asking leading questions after an event could alter what people remembered. She asked people about a car accident and asked either, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other, or how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. The single word change, hit versus smashed, caused people to remember the accident as more severe and even to report seeing broken glass that was never there. False memories are not the exception. They are the rule. Attention is another domain cognitive psychology illuminated. The human mind cannot process everything in the environment simultaneously, so it selects what to focus on and filters out the rest. This is mostly useful, but it also means you are constantly missing things. In one of the most famous demonstrations in all of psychology, the invisible gorilla experiment, researchers asked people to watch a video and count how many times players in white shirts passed a basketball. About half of all viewers completely failed to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the middle of the scene, stopping to beat its chest and walking off. People were so focused on their counting task that a gorilla became invisible. This is called inattentional blindness, and it reveals something unsettling. What you see is not reality. It is a selected, constructed interpretation of reality, shaped by where your attention happens to be pointing. The architecture of emotion. What are you really feeling? Now let us go deeper into the territory that most people care about most. Emotion. What are emotions really? Where do they come from? Why do they feel so overwhelming and so utterly beyond our control? For a long time, people assumed that emotions were the opposite of thought, primitive, animal forces that dragged rational thinking down into chaos. But psychology has revealed something far more interesting. Emotions are not the enemy of thinking. They are inseparable from it. Without emotion, decision-making becomes impossible. The neurologist Antonio Damasio studied patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in emotion and decision-making. These patients retained their intellectual abilities perfectly. They could reason, remember, and calculate. But they could not make decisions. They would spend hours deliberating between trivial choices, unable to feel which option was better, because feeling is precisely what guides judgment. Emotion is not the opposite of reason. Emotion is the foundation that reason stands on. The psychologist Paul Ekman spent decades studying facial expressions across cultures and concluded that at least 6 basic emotions are universal, expressed in the same way by people everywhere, regardless of culture, language, or upbringing. Happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. Later, he added contempt. These basic emotions appear to be hardwired into our biology, part of our evolved inheritance. But the situations that trigger them, the ways we express them, the meaning we give them, all of these are shaped by culture and experience. James Gross, a pioneering researcher in emotion regulation, has studied how people manage their emotional lives. Most people use a strategy called cognitive reappraisal, deliberately reinterpreting the meaning of a situation to change its emotional impact. If you get rejected for a job and think, "This means I am worthless," you will feel crushed. But if you think, "This means I need to build new skills," you will feel motivated. Same event, completely different emotional outcome, simply by changing the story you tell about it. Research consistently shows that people who are skilled at cognitive reappraisal have better mental health, better relationships, and higher well-being across their entire lives. The other common emotion regulation strategy is expressive suppression, pushing the feeling down, hiding it, pretending it is not there. This feels effective in the short term. But research shows it backfires. Suppressing emotion does not reduce its physiological intensity. Your body is still experiencing the full force of the feeling. You just stop showing it. And over time, chronic suppression leads to emotional numbing, disconnection from others, and increased risk of anxiety and depression. The feelings you refuse to feel do not disappear. They go underground and find other exits. Personality. The fingerprint of the self. Why are some people warm and some cold? Why do some people thrive in chaos and others need order? Why do some people tell strangers their deepest secrets in the first 10 minutes and others guard their inner world like a fortress? This is the territory of personality psychology. For most of the 20th century, personality psychology was a battlefield of competing theories. But by the 1980s, a broad consensus began to emerge around what researchers call the Big Five personality traits, also known by the acronym OCEAN. Openness to experience is the first dimension. People high in openness are curious, imaginative, and hungry for novelty. They seek out new ideas, new places, new ways of thinking. People low in openness prefer the familiar, the conventional, and the concrete. They are not less intelligent. They simply have a different relationship to uncertainty and novelty. Conscientiousness is the second dimension. Highly conscientious people are organized, disciplined, goal-directed, and reliable. They plan ahead, follow through, and delay gratification. Conscientiousness is one of the strongest predictors of life success across virtually every domain. Academic achievement, career performance, health behaviors, and relationship stability. If you want to predict how well someone will do in life, measure their conscientiousness. Extroversion is the third dimension. Extroverts gain energy from social interaction. They are stimulated by busy environments, seek out excitement, and process their thoughts by speaking them aloud. Introverts are energized by solitude. They do their best thinking internally, prefer deep one-on-one conversations to large group gatherings, and need quiet to recharge. Neither is superior. They are simply different ways of orienting to the world. Agreeableness is the fourth dimension. Highly agreeable people are warm, trusting, cooperative, and empathetic. They value harmony and tend to put others' needs before their own. Low agreeableness people are more competitive, skeptical, and willing to challenge others. High agreeableness is wonderful for relationships, but can lead to difficulty asserting boundaries. Low agreeableness supports leadership and negotiation, but can damage personal connections. Neuroticism is the fifth dimension. People high in neuroticism experience emotional volatility, frequent anxiety, mood swings, irritability, and vulnerability to stress. People low in neuroticism tend toward emotional stability and resilience. High neuroticism is one of the strongest predictors of mental health challenges, including anxiety disorders and depression. It is also one of the traits most influenced by both genetics and early environment. These 5 dimensions do not put people in boxes. Every person is a unique profile across all 5 dimensions, a fingerprint of tendencies that shapes how they perceive, respond to, and create their experience of the world. The social mind, you are not who you think you are. Here is one of the most disturbing, liberating, and important discoveries in all of psychology. Your behavior is far more influenced by the situation you are in than you believe. You like to think you are a consistent, coherent self whose actions flow from stable values and character. You are not. At least, not nearly as much as you imagine. Social psychology is the study of how people influence each other, and its findings are consistently humbling. Let us begin with Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments. In the 1960s, Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary people could participate in atrocities like the Holocaust. He designed an experiment in which participants were instructed by an authority figure in a white lab coat to administer electric shocks to another person whenever they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks were not real, and the person receiving them was an actor. But the participants did not know this. They heard screams, protests, and desperate pleas to stop. And yet, when the authority figure calmly said, "Please continue," most participants continued administering shocks all the way to the highest level on the dial, labeled Danger, Severe Shock. About 65% of all participants went all the way. Milgram's conclusion was not that these people were unusually cruel. Most were ordinary, decent people who were genuinely distressed by what they were doing. His conclusion was that ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary harm when placed in a situation that creates pressure toward obedience to authority. The situation was more powerful than the character. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments revealed something equally unsettling. Asch placed people in groups and asked them to judge which of 3 lines matched a reference line in length. The answer was obviously clear, but all the other members of the group, who were actors, gave the same wrong answer. And a significant portion of the real participants went along with the group, denying the evidence of their own eyes rather than stand out as different. The pressure to belong, to conform, to not be the one who sees things differently can override direct sensory experience. Philip Zimbardo's infamous Stanford prison experiment in 1971 assigned college students randomly to the roles of either guards or prisoners in a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building. Within days, the guards had become genuinely cruel and authoritarian. The prisoners had become submissive and despairing. The experiment had to be shut down after just 6 days. Zimbardo's conclusion: normal people, randomly assigned to a role in a powerful situation, will become the role. The situation swallows the self. These experiments are disturbing. They are meant to be, because understanding the power of the situation is not an excuse for harmful behavior. It is an essential piece of self-knowledge. If you know that authority, conformity, and role assignment can override your values without you even noticing, you can be more vigilant. You can build in reflection. You can cultivate the psychological courage to act from your values even when the situation pushes against them. Motivation: what actually drives you? We think we know why we do what we do. We are almost always wrong. Abraham Maslow proposed one of the most famous theories in all of psychology: the hierarchy of needs. He arranged human needs in a pyramid. At the base were physiological needs: food, water, shelter, sleep. Above those were safety needs: security, stability, freedom from fear. Then came belonging and love, the need for connection, intimacy, community. Then esteem, the need to feel competent, respected, and valued. And at the very top, the need that Maslow called self-actualization, the drive to become fully what one is capable of becoming, to realize one's deepest potential. Maslow argued that lower needs must be met before higher needs become motivating. A person who is starving does not spend much time thinking about self-actualization. This made intuitive sense and captured something real about human motivation. But research has shown it is far more complex. People pursue love and meaning even under conditions of poverty and danger. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, documented how even in the most extreme conditions of suffering and deprivation, human beings could find meaning, and that meaning itself became a source of survival. Self-determination theory, developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, offers a more nuanced map of human motivation. They identified 3 core psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is the need to feel that your actions come from your own values and choices, not from external pressure. Competence is the need to feel effective and capable in what you do. Relatedness is the need for genuine connection with others. When these 3 needs are met, people experience intrinsic motivation. They do things because they find them genuinely meaningful, interesting, or enjoyable. When these needs are frustrated, intrinsic motivation collapses, and people either disengage or become dependent on external rewards and punishments. This has enormous implications for education, parenting, management, and relationships. Offering someone a reward for something they already enjoy doing can actually reduce their enjoyment of it. This is called the over-justification effect, and it is one of the most counterintuitive and well-replicated findings in all of motivation research. Mental health: when the mind turns against itself. No journey through psychology is complete without confronting mental illness, the territory where the mind's architecture breaks down, or breaks through, or simply breaks. 1 in 4 people on this planet will experience a significant mental health challenge in their lifetime. Mental illness is not weakness, not moral failure, not a choice. It is the result of complex interactions between genetics, brain chemistry, early experience, trauma, stress, and social environment. And it is treatable. Anxiety disorders are the most common mental health challenges. Anxiety itself is not the enemy. It is an ancient warning system designed to protect you from danger. The problem is when this system becomes miscalibrated, firing alarms in situations that pose no real threat, making the body mobilize for a crisis that exists only in the mind. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobias, and post-traumatic stress disorder are all variations on this theme of a threat response system that has gone out of proportion to actual danger. Depression is different. Where anxiety is the mind racing forward into feared futures, depression is often the mind collapsing inward into a sense of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and profound disconnection. It is not sadness. People with depression often describe feeling nothing at all, a grey, flat absence where feeling used to be. Depression involves changes in brain chemistry, particularly in systems involving serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. It also involves distorted thinking patterns, catastrophizing, all-or-nothing thinking, personalization, and what cognitive therapists call the negative cognitive triad: negative views of the self, the world, and the future. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, discovered that depression could be treated by identifying and challenging these distorted thought patterns. He showed that when people learn to recognize their cognitive distortions and systematically test them against reality, depression lifts. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, has since become the most researched and empirically supported psychological treatment in the world, effective for anxiety, depression, phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorder, eating disorders, and many other conditions. Schizophrenia is among the most misunderstood of all mental illnesses. It is not split personality. That is a different and far rarer condition. Schizophrenia is a serious disorder of reality testing, involving hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and what researchers call negative symptoms: flattened emotion, reduced motivation, and social withdrawal. It has a strong genetic component and typically first appears in late adolescence or early adulthood. Despite its severity, many people with schizophrenia live full and meaningful lives with proper treatment and support. The most important shift in how we understand mental health in recent decades has been moving away from a binary model, either you have a mental illness or you do not, toward a dimensional model. Mental health exists on a spectrum. Everyone sits somewhere on that spectrum, and everyone moves along it over time. Just as physical health is not simply the absence of disease, but a positive state of vitality and well-being, mental health is not simply the absence of disorder, but a positive state of psychological flourishing. Developmental psychology: how you became you. To truly understand a person, you must understand how they grew. Developmental psychology traces the arc of human growth from the moment of conception through old age and death, tracking how we change and how we remain the same. Jean Piaget revolutionized our understanding of how children think. He showed that children are not simply incomplete adults, not empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge. They are active meaning makers, constructing their understanding of the world through their own exploration and experience. He identified 4 stages of cognitive development: the sensory-motor stage in infancy, when children learn through direct sensory and physical experience; the pre-operational stage in early childhood, when language explodes but thinking is still highly egocentric; the concrete operational stage in middle childhood, when children can think logically about concrete objects and events; and the formal operational stage in adolescence, when the capacity for abstract reasoning emerges. Erik Erikson offered a different map of development, focused not on cognition, but on the psychosocial challenges that arise at each stage of life. He proposed 8 stages, each presenting a central conflict whose resolution, or lack of resolution, shapes the person we become. In infancy, the conflict is trust versus mistrust. Does the world provide consistent care and safety, or is it unpredictable and threatening? In early childhood, it is autonomy versus shame and doubt. In school years, it is industry versus inferiority. In adolescence, the central challenge is identity versus role confusion, the defining question of who am I? In young adulthood, it is intimacy versus isolation. In middle adulthood, generativity versus stagnation. And in late adulthood, ego integrity versus despair. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth gave us attachment theory, perhaps the most influential framework in all of developmental psychology. Bowlby argued that human infants come into the world biologically programmed to seek closeness to a protective caregiver, because proximity to a caregiver meant survival in the environment in which we evolved. This attachment system is the foundation upon which all later relationships are built. Ainsworth designed the famous strange situation experiment to measure the quality of attachment between children and their caregivers. She observed children when briefly separated from and then reunited with their primary caregiver and identified distinct patterns. Securely attached children used the caregiver as a safe base for exploration, were distressed when separated, but quickly comforted upon reunion. Anxiously attached children were highly distressed by separation and difficult to comfort upon return, clinging and angry simultaneously. Avoidantly attached children showed little distress at separation and little interest in reunion, having learned to suppress attachment needs because their caregiver had consistently been unresponsive. These early attachment patterns do not determine destiny, but they do create working models of relationships, internal blueprints that tell us what to expect from intimacy, how much we can trust, how vulnerable it is safe to be. And these blueprints shape, quietly and profoundly, every relationship we have for the rest of our lives. Positive psychology, the science of flourishing. For most of its history, psychology focused on what goes wrong with the human mind. This made sense. Suffering is urgent and understanding dysfunction is essential. But by the late 1990s, a growing number of psychologists began asking a different question. What makes life worth living? Not just the absence of misery, but the presence of genuine human flourishing. This was the beginning of positive psychology. Martin Seligman, who had spent his career studying helplessness and depression, became a leading voice of this new movement. He proposed that well-being consists of 5 elements, captured in the acronym PERMA: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. Genuine flourishing requires all 5. A life of pure pleasure-seeking without engagement or meaning tends toward emptiness. A life of great achievement without positive relationships tends toward isolation. The fully human life weaves all 5 threads together. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi contributed one of the most powerful concepts in positive psychology: flow. Flow is the state of complete absorption in a challenging activity when the difficulty of the task perfectly matches the level of your skill. In flow, self-consciousness disappears. Time distorts. You are fully present, fully engaged, fully alive. Athletes call it being in the zone. Artists describe it as the work moving through them. Csikszentmihalyi studied thousands of people across dozens of cultures and found that flow was consistently associated with the highest levels of satisfaction and happiness. And crucially, flow almost never happens during passive leisure. It happens when you are actively engaged in something difficult and meaningful. Carol Dweck's research on mindset has transformed education and is transforming how people think about potential and growth. Dweck identified 2 fundamental orientations toward ability. People with a fixed mindset believe that intelligence, talent, and capability are innate and unchangeable. You either have it or you do not. Effort is either unnecessary if you are talented or pointless if you are not. Failure is evidence of permanent inadequacy. People with a growth mindset believe that abilities can be developed through dedication, learning, and effort. Failure is information, not identity. Challenges are opportunities, not threats. Decades of research show that the growth mindset leads to higher achievement, greater resilience, more love of learning, and deeper satisfaction across virtually every domain of life. The mind and the body, they are one. One of the most important shifts in modern psychology is the recognition that mind and body are not separate entities. They are one system, constantly influencing each other in ways that are profound and often counterintuitive. Stress is the clearest example. The stress response is an ancient biological mechanism designed to help you survive immediate physical threats. When you perceive danger, your brain triggers a cascade of hormonal changes. Adrenaline surges, cortisol floods the bloodstream, heart rate accelerates, muscles tighten, digestion shuts down. You are ready to fight or flee. This response is life-saving in genuinely dangerous situations. But the human brain has a problem. It cannot reliably distinguish between a tiger chasing you and a difficult conversation you are dreading. The imagined threat triggers the same response as the real one. And in modern life, where threats are psychological and chronic rather than physical and brief, the stress response becomes a slow poison. Chronic stress suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep, damages the cardiovascular system, shrinks the hippocampus, and significantly increases the risk of depression and anxiety. The mind under prolonged pressure changes the body in measurable, lasting ways. But the reverse is equally true. The body shapes the mind. Exercise is one of the most powerful interventions for depression and anxiety that exists, comparable in many studies to medication. Sleep deprivation does not just make you tired. It impairs judgment, heightens emotional reactivity, disrupts memory consolidation, and increases the risk of virtually every mental health challenge. What you eat affects your mood, your cognition, and your risk of depression. The vagus nerve, the long wandering nerve that connects the brain to virtually every organ in the body, carries information in both directions, from brain to body and from body to brain. Your gut contains hundreds of millions of neurons and produces more serotonin than your brain does. The field of psychoneuroimmunology, which studies the interactions between psychological processes, the nervous system, and the immune system, is revealing connections between mind and body that would have seemed like mysticism to previous generations. The final truth: you are always changing. Here is perhaps the most important thing psychology has discovered about the human mind. It is not fixed. You are not finished. The person you are today is not the person you will be in 10 years, in 5 years, in 1 year, perhaps even in 1 month, if you choose to grow. For most of human history, people believed that personality was set in stone after childhood, or at the latest after adolescence. Neuroscience has demonstrated that this is false. The brain retains neuroplasticity throughout life, the capacity to form new neural connections, reorganize existing ones, and change its own structure in response to experience. Every new skill you learn, every new perspective you genuinely adopt, every old pattern you consistently interrupt, physically changes your brain. You are not a static thing. You are a process. Psychotherapy works in part by creating new experiences that update old patterns. When a person in therapy begins to feel truly understood, perhaps for the first time, by another human being, it does not just feel good. It rewires the attachment systems laid down in early childhood. When a person learns to face a fear they have been avoiding for years, it does not just resolve the phobia. It rebuilds their sense of agency, their belief in their own capacity to act despite discomfort. Growth does not require therapy. It requires honesty, courage, and practice. It requires the willingness to look at the patterns you have been repeating and ask where they came from. It requires the humility to admit that much of what you think, feel, and do is not fully under your conscious control, and the determination to bring more of it into awareness. It requires choosing again and again to respond rather than react, to reflect before you act, to question the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what is possible. What you now carry. You began this listening as one person, and you are ending it as someone who knows more about the invisible architecture of human experience than most people will learn in a lifetime. You now understand that beneath your conscious awareness runs a vast and powerful unconscious that shapes your perceptions, drives your behavior, and colors every experience you have. You know that your memories are not recordings but reconstructions, vulnerable to suggestion, revision, and distortion. You know that your emotions are not obstacles to good thinking, but essential guides that, when properly understood and regulated, make you wiser and more human. You understand that your personality, while relatively stable, is not a cage. That your early attachments shaped your templates for love, but do not dictate your capacity for it. That your mindset about growth is perhaps the single most important factor in determining what you will become. That the situation you are in can influence you in ways you will not notice unless you are watching for them. That genuine well-being is not the absence of pain, but the presence of engagement, connection, and meaning. You carry now the understanding that 1 in 4 people around you is struggling with something invisible, and that this struggle deserves compassion, not judgment. That the cruelest things people do often come from the deepest wounds. That healing is possible, that brains change, that people grow, that the story is never finished. Psychology is not just a science, it is an act of radical empathy, the sustained effort to understand what it is like to be another human being with all their complexity, contradiction, beauty, and brokenness. And in understanding others, we come slowly, imperfectly, and necessarily to understand ourselves. The greatest journey you will ever take is inward. You have already begun.